listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the federal government has joined a number of other countries, including Britain and Canada, and imposed sanctions on two Israeli ministers for inciting violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. The move has been slammed by key coalition members and also the United States, who have condemned the sanctions. But our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister are standing firm. So what will this latest move mean for the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza and our fragile partnership with the US? But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Wednesday, the 11th of June. A curfew is now in force in downtown Los Angeles after a fifth day of protests over immigration raids. LA Mayor Karen Bass has also declared a local emergency and says the curfew was necessary to stop vandalism and looting. In a televised address, California's Governor Gavin Newsom says the US president is acting like a dictator, accusing Mr. Trump of assaulting democracy by sending in federal troops without the consent of local authorities.
This brazen abuse of power by a sitting president inflamed a combustible situation, putting our people, our officers, and even our National Guard at risk.
Mr. Trump deployed the National Guard over the weekend, with hundreds of Marines and other US soldiers also on standby to be sent onto LA streets. The immigration protests are now spreading across the US, with rallies in a number of cities, including New York, Dallas, and Atlanta. Swedish activist Greta Thunberg has arrived in Paris after she was detained on a charity boat headed to Gaza to administer humanitarian aid. The 22-year-old was deported by Israel. Greta telling the media there are still a lot of uncertainties at play, with some of the activists on board the vessel Freedom Flotilla still in custody.
On international waters, we were illegally attacked and kidnapped by Israel and taken against our will to Israel, where we were detained, and then some of us deported, some are still there.
And researchers say they could have found the final resting place of the world's richest shipwreck. The wreck was first discovered a decade ago, but now state-of-the-art underwater technology has uncovered the clearest evidence yet that it could be a famous Spanish ship that was attacked and blown up by the British Navy in the 1700s. Packed with coins and precious jewels, the wreck beneath the waters on the Caribbean is estimated to be worth around $31 billion. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Sarah Schwartz, human rights lawyer and co-founding executive officer of the Jewish Council of Australia, on what these latest sanctions on two Israeli ministers mean for international law and the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. We have heard the news today that Penny Wong, our Foreign Minister, has announced that Australia, together with the UK, Canada, New Zealand and Norway, are imposing these sanctions on two ministers in the Israeli government for, quote, inciting violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, the Foreign Minister has come out saying these sanctions were months in the working.
I think that this is a really positive step from our government, and it shows that the government is making steps towards actually treating Israel like it would any other state which is flagrantly breaching international law. And I think by targeting these two ministers who have been really at the helm of inciting settler-led violence in the West Bank and the expansions of settlements which are already illegal, this is a really positive step. Australia needs to go a lot further in order to be fully compliant with our responsibilities under international law, but this is a positive step.
So even today, after this announcement was made, we saw the US come out straight away. Secretary Marco Rubio has come out saying that the US condemns the sanctions imposed by our government, along with those other governments I mentioned earlier, saying they do not, quote, advance US-led efforts to achieve a ceasefire nor to bring all the hostages home. Would you agree with that?
I would not agree that the US is actually invested in any sort of peace in Palestine. We are now almost 2 years into what major human rights bodies and scholars have said amounts to the crime of genocide in Gaza. Currently, Israel is implementing an illegal blockade, blocking all humanitarian supplies from entering Gaza. And only days ago, Israel intercepted the Freedom Flotilla, a flotilla headed with baby supplies to reach starving children in Gaza. Israel is flagrantly breaching international law in this moment with the assistance of the United States, who continues to supply arms to Israel, and with the President of the United States, who has stated publicly that he wants to turn Gaza into a Riviera, basically supporting the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza, a very serious crime under international law.
The Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has hit back straight at these comments made by the US government, thanks to Secretary Marco Rubio, saying, quote, that their response to these sanctions is predictable, frankly. In regards to what happens from here, how important do you think this stance is from Australia combined with these other countries to impose these sanctions?
I think it's really important to see Australia joining with other countries to take these steps and joining in these alliances in a way that is separate from what the US is doing in this moment. We have to remember that these are two ministers who have made statements calling for the annihilation of Gaza, have called for new settlements in the West Bank when the International Court of Justice has already ruled that the entire settlement enterprise that Israel is engaged in, which leads to Palestinians living under military rule and not having the same level of rights as Israelis, is a crime under international law. And so it's positive to see that our government is actually taking a stand and showing that we are committed to international law and we are committed to human rights, and we will step out and we will step against what the US is doing in this moment, because what the US is doing in this moment, its actions are actually fueling both the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank, and is creating a situation which will create violence for many years to come.
Sarah, in regards to not only division with these sanctions between Australia and the US at the moment, but it seems these sanctions have created division in our own country between the federal government and the opposition. The moderate Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg has come out saying the federal government, quote, has made a mistake in applying these sanctions to two Israeli government ministers. And he says at this stage they have demanded a briefing on exactly what the government has announced.
I think the Australian public has made a decision in regard to its commitment to compassion, fairness and human rights, and that was borne out in the election results. And there was a rejection of Trumpism, there was a rejection of the Liberal Party and Peter Dutton and the type of language that they use, and their calls, including in regard to Gaza, they're calls which are entirely inconsistent with basic human rights and humanity. I think the Australian people made a decision and they voted for, and Anthony Albanese has won this election. And now the time is for the Labor Party to actually show to the people that they are going to implement the mandate on which they were elected on. And I think that this is part of it. So it's not surprising that the Liberal Party would object to these sorts of sanctions against two very extreme individuals who have already been accused of major international crimes. I don't think it's a particularly extreme move for the government to sanction these individuals. And I think that the government and Anthony Albanese has to be willing to step away from the Liberal Party and the National Party in this moment. He has to be able to take a stand for himself and listen to the calls of the Australian people who are seeing, the images coming out of Gaza. We're seeing pictures of starving children. We're seeing pictures of mothers carrying their children who are deceased. We know that this situation is wrong. We're seeing villages be depopulated in the West Bank. We're seeing villages Palestinians being forced out of their homes, subjected to violence. We can see with our two eyes that this situation is wrong and we want our government to take a stand. And that might require Anthony Albanese to step out of, bipartisanship and to actually take a stand that's called for both by Australians and by the international community.
Sarah, the Prime Minister is certainly standing firm on imposing these sanctions, and also the Foreign Minister. You mentioned earlier that Australians voted the Labor Party back in for another 3 years at this time. They have a mandate to deliver on what they promised going to the election. Mr Albanese is set to have a very interesting meeting with Mr Trump, considering what is going on in the world right now later this week. That is scheduled at the G7 meeting later this week. It's very different to make a firm stand in the safety of your own country, but they are taking on the US. Do you think the Prime Minister will follow through? Because the US, one may say, if we like it or we don't like it, is an important trading and strategic partner.
I think that given the way that the US is going in this moment, and given how the Australian people have voted in a very definitive rejection of Trumpism, our government has a decision to make in this moment, and we have to choose other allies. But we also have to show our moral fortitude as a nation here. And that moral fortitude in this moment calls us to stand with the people of Palestine, with Palestinians who are being slaughtered and who are being starved and who are being subjected to what all accounts has been shown to be a genocide. And I think that history will look back on this moment to, and look back on who Australia formed alliances with. And I think the Prime Minister knows that if we continue to stick with the United States in this moment, history is going to look back very poorly on Australia as a nation that stood by and was complicit in the genocide of a people.
Sarah, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that was human rights lawyer Sarah Schwartz. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.